Disrupting Japan, Episode 89. Disrupting Japan is sponsored by Justa. Now, I've known the team at Justa for years, and I've been recommending them long before they became a sponsor. Justa is really the only recruiting site that gets bilingual startups. Whether you're looking for American engineers or Japanese sales staff or the other way around, Justa can help you out. Unlike recruiting companies, they are priced to be very startup-friendly, and unlike job boards, they're an active part of the startup community here, and they're trusted by some of the best talent Japan has to offer. So drop by justa.io and see what they're about. Welcome to Disrupting Japan, straight talk from Japan's most successful entrepreneurs. I'm Tim Romero, and thanks for joining me. You know, crowdfunding and crowdsourcing in Japan largely gained in its popularity in projects related to the massive March 2011 earthquake and ensuing tsunami, and the release of radiation at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. In fact, longtime listeners have heard the founders of some of Japan's largest crowdfunding and crowdsourcing companies explain that breaking away from this image of crowdfunding as a social good was something they had to overcome before their startups became truly successful. Well, today, we're going to sit down with Pieter Franken of Safecast, one of the earliest examples of widespread crowdsourcing in Japan. And we talk about how they've grown from a Japanese patchwork solution to the leader of a global movement. After the Fukushima nuclear disaster, people throughout Japan were worried about radiation. TEPCO, who operated the facilities, and the Japanese government assured everyone that things were under control and that everyone was perfectly safe. As you might imagine, however, most people were highly skeptical of these claims. The radiation data just wasn't there, or it wasn't being shared with the public, or it wasn't believed when it was shared with the public. Pieter and his team started Safecast to make sure that lack of information and lack of transparency would never happen again. And they began building low-cost Geiger counters that people around the country, and then around the world, could use to measure their local area and then have all that data uploaded into the cloud and made available for anyone. It's an amazing story, and it's one that Pieter tells much better than I do. So let's hear from our sponsors and get right to the interview. Some of Japan's largest companies are starting open innovation programs and actively reaching out to global startups. They're new at this, and that's where Crew, with two W's, comes in. Crew runs corporate startup accelerators for companies like Toyota and Panasonic and dozens more. And these programs are one of the best ways to jumpstart your business in Japan. Many are open to global startups, and they're completely free. Now, I've known and worked with the Crew team, and they're probably doing more than anyone to bridge the gap between corporate Japan and global startups. So drop by Crew with two W's .me/4-startups and get started. So I'm sitting here with Pieter Franken of Safecast. You guys make an open environmental data collection system for everyone, but I think you can explain much better than I can what it is.
To explain what we're doing, the best thing is just to go back in time a little bit. Exactly 6 years ago, in March 2011, we all witnessed the big earthquake, and as part of that, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. And that's really where Safecast started. It started from the need to know what was happening in terms of radiation exposure in Japan. And as you know, most of the folks that were here will remember very well, there was lots of concern about that, but also the biggest problem was there was just no data available. Whatever the authorities had was very sparse, and most of it was not useful. Nothing was really from Fukushima itself, and we started to try to solve that problem.
was also, as I recall, that there was a lot of people that just simply didn't believe what the government was telling them.
Yeah, so the trust was, lots of people didn't trust TEPCO's own assessment. But the real problem, I think, in retrospect, was there was very little information available. Whatever was available was not disclosed. And by the sheer fact that information was not available, that created even a bigger distrust. So, and that was really the space where we decided to start Safecast. We said we must know what is happening in the environment. Radiation at that time was the critical driver. And we said, how can we make this as open and transparent as possible? And we did all kind of things in the beginning. We didn't start with the solar iron and building things. We actually thought that information would be available, yet it was just hard to find or not easy to digest. So we started to look around on the internet, hoping to find all that information and then put it on a website and share that. However, that didn't really fan out. We did find information. Most of it was from some universities that all were in Tokyo, all measuring something that wasn't relevant. And our map was very empty after looking around for 2 weeks. So we started to rethink.
Did the Japanese government have a unified national data collection system for radiation?
Yes and no. They actually had a system. The system was called SPEEDY. And that system was originally designed to predict where the plume would go after a nuclear disaster. So it had sensors and it had a huge mainframe with a huge piece of software on it that would read all the sensor data and then churn out a projected, the trajectory of the plume. And the key thing is that system was there, it did operate, but it is not a publicly accessible system. It's not that you go online and see what is happening here. So the information was exclusively available to the Japanese government only, and for all kind of reasons, which they decided to ignore that information. So this is one of the big parts of the whole accident that went horribly wrong. So they didn't look at that information, and they started to improvise from that point onwards. So to answer your question, yes, there was a system, not publicly available, and effectively was not used. Today, that system has been decommissioned, and today Japan doesn't have that system anymore. So we actually have less than what we had before the accident.
Well, hopefully with Safecast, we've got a little more thorough data than we had before.
Right. So we realized that information wasn't available. We couldn't put it on a website. So we said, okay, maybe we can crowdsource the data. So the initial idea was to buy Geiger counters and give them to folks so that they could collect the data and tell us, so we could publish that. We did try to do that, but shortly after the accident, all Geiger counters worldwide sold out because everybody in Japan needed one. But what we didn't realize was that they would be sold out for 6 to 12 months because the supply chain for this is not, they're not iPhones or something where millions can be produced on demand.
I'm sure there has been a slow, steady demand for them.
Yeah, so exactly. So the factories that are churning them out were not going to scale up, and were not very easy to scale up because of the actual sensors are not so easy to manufacture. So the net is no Geiger counters. So we had actually run a Kickstarter campaign by that time. So we got some money. And then we started to rethink, so if we don't have Geiger counters, what do we do next? So we had a few Geiger counters that we had by that time. We have maybe 10 or so. And the idea was born that maybe we can do what Google does, kind of a street map view of radiation by driving around. And that kind of started just really into something that we thought we could execute. So we did a trial. We had a truck driver go up, David Kell, and he was one of the volunteers going up by truck. And we gave him a Geiger counter and an iPhone, and we said, whenever you stop, just take a measurement, and after you have taken a measurement, just upload it. So as he was traveling up north, he was keep on sending these pictures up, and we could see what was happening. So it was kind of the real first version. But it was just to see that, would this work? The second version of this was a group of Keio University students where we were more structured. They were driving up, and we said every 5 minutes, take a picture of the Geiger counter, and they kind of duct taped the Geiger counter onto their car on the outside.
Right.
And they were sitting inside, and so they could see the screen of the Geiger counter, and every 5 minutes they snapped the picture.
Yeah, well, in principle, that's still kind of what you're doing.
And that's what we're doing. The only thing we did is we automated the process. So we had a bunch of people that were at Tokyo Hackerspace that we all got together, and we started to say, how can we make this thing with Arduinos and make it more automated? So we put the whole thing together. We chose a box to put it all in, which looked like a kind of a bento box. And we hooked up a computer, and that was kind of the first thing we got going.
So you basically designed a Geiger counter, a do-it-yourself Geiger counter kit.
Right. Well, the kit came much later. This was really a real, we took a real commercial Geiger counter because we didn't have anything else. So we took that, we kind of interfaced it with an Arduino, hooked it up to a PC, and on the PC we wrote a piece of software that every 5 seconds would read out the value from the Geiger counter and store it on the hard disk. So it was really the first thing we did. So with that, we went to Fukushima and to do our first measurements.
Okay. And how long after the earthquake was this?
So this was about 6 weeks after the earthquake, roughly. And we knew that time was working against us because, as the disaster was progressing, there was no information. But, bringing information, a year after the accident is not really interesting. We wanted to know now. And more specifically, I have a family here, I have a young daughter. I wanted to kind of know what my risk was and should I move away from Tokyo or, what is happening here.
6 weeks after the accident, there was still a tremendous amount of concern.
Absolutely. Even today, the concern still continues for specific areas. So we really wanted to move as quickly as possible so that people would get the data as early as possible. So the first so-called BGeiger, which stands for Bento Geiger Counter System, on the road was towards the end of April 2011. So at that time, we drove up to Koriyama City and we started measuring there. We collected the data. We also immediately were on the ground. We met people. We started to see that the levels were way higher than what we had thought they would be based on what NSK News and other news sources were telling us. So, and then we started to publish our first radiation map.
And at this point, you just had one unit.
Yeah, and at this point, very quickly after we built the first versions of this, we eliminated the computer, the laptop, and we used an Arduino self-contained system. So it was kind of we made it waterproof. And we also made it super easy to use, basically on and off switch, and it would just record or not record. So no need for people to understand computers and stuff like that. So we could hand them out to volunteers in Fukushima. So that was kind of the next major wave. And it was still kind of clunky, and it still required a commercial Geiger counter to be in the box. So they were relatively expensive, and we had shortage of supply, etc., etc. But we had, I think, tens of volunteers over the first 3 months that started to measure. We kept on churning out these boxes by putting them together here in Tokyo, and we started to get more and more data. So I think in the first 3 months we had about 500,000 data points collected, and we started to really kind of see what was kind of happening in Fukushima. So, the contours of where things were high, where things were low, and we really started to realize that it was very blotchy. It wasn't really predictable based on distance, and even in cities that were exposed inside the city, you would have higher areas, lower areas. So it really started to become clear that in order to really get an idea what was happening, you had to go measure everything.
So when you say like a high area and a low area, you mean like different parts of town or different corners on the same street?
Different corners on the same street could be quite different. Yeah, and what we found out is that had a lot to do with characteristics like a big roof would be kind of a concentrator of fallout into one little corner that could create a much higher hotspot. Also, the soil or the road or the material it fell on had an effect on how high you would measure. So we literally could walk around, a short area and have very different measurements.
Wow. Okay, so you really do need very high resolution. You need a tremendous amount of data to get anything meaningful out of this.
Yes, absolutely. And what is really important to understand is that the people that were still living there, for them this was really, real reality. Is my street okay or not okay? What should I do? Whatever. And we started to really work with people in communities that really wanted us to help them out to measure their street, their workplace, their school, their hospital. Then there was a secondary thing is that people that, after all, weren't living in affected areas, including, Tokyo was affected, but not so much affected as Fukushima. It didn't really matter where you were. People were equally concerned. And the reason for that was we just didn't know. So
right. Well, I mean, people didn't trust the data they were being told. They didn't understand what the data meant anyway.
Right.
So.
But also the same thing in Tokyo, right? Whatever the data that was available was, a few locations only in Tokyo were measured, and that was the official measurement. But we knew in Tokyo there were hotspots as well, in Chiba there was a hotspot and stuff like that. It became equally important to measure Tokyo or Kyushu as it was to do Fukushima because the concern was across the country. So 2011 summer we kind of made the commitment. Our goal was to measure everything. That solves the problem. And the Japanese government was at that time had their hands full measuring inside the exclusion zone and wasn't measuring outside. So it was a great complementary thing to do.
So up until this point, the people who had been measuring had been affiliates or it wasn't a true crowdsourcing community yet, right?
Well,
or was it just turning that corner?
Well, what is true crowdsourcing is we didn't direct people to go do anything. People would raise their hands and we would provide them equipment to go and measure with. From a Safecast point of view, at that time we were maybe maximum 10 people in Tokyo that were working on it. And we had way more people in the field doing all the measurements.
So when did you develop the first Geiger counter kit?
Yes, the kit was kind of born about a year after that. By the time we already had maybe 4 or 5 iterations of the system that we had built initially. By the time it had become quite sophisticated. But one of the big things was some people wanted to own it, and we were only lending it out. So the other thing is the form factor. If we could make it smaller, wouldn't it be great? If we would kind of be able to avoid the Geiger counter in there, we could bring down the cost. So we experimented with that, and we found a form factor we kind of liked, and then we iterated a little bit further. And then the idea was born, if we can make this a kit, then people could build it themselves. So that would take away the problem of manufacturing, which has a huge lead time.
But didn't you run into the same problem before of the supply chain that makes the detection units?
Well, yes, but this is about a year after the accident. So around that time, the supply chain has sprung into gear. And also we were lucky that one of our advisors was running a company making those, and he could help us source the equipment. The first batches of these kits were built in workshops. So we basically got 10 or many people in the same room, and we would teach people how to build them. Then over time, when we had a company that made it into a kit that you could buy on Amazon, so suddenly outside of Japan, people started to buy them. Fast forwarding 6 years later, we have many of these in use worldwide now, in many, many countries where people are using these.
About how many units are there worldwide?
My guesstimate is around over 1,000. Growing rapidly, that's why it's my guesstimate. And these are now being used in many, many countries. I think we have counted way over 90 countries where we have data from.
I imagine most of the coverage is in Japan.
Well, not anymore. About 3 years ago, we got lots of volunteers in the US that started to measure a lot. After that, Europe came online big time, and we have lots of volunteers in Europe now that are measuring fairly seriously. Roughly, maybe still over 50% is Japan, but the rest is over 40% is from other countries now.
Okay, so the device itself it's fairly expensive. It's $600 or so for the kit.
Right.
It's not a trivial matter to decide to do this. So who are the people and organizations that decide to participate? Are they universities, or are they just...
There's no simple answer. It's very varied. We have, of course, individuals like ourselves, but we have companies that for some reason are measuring other things already on the street, and they find it interesting to participate and contribute, but also learn a bit about open hardware and how does this whole new thing work. We have universities that are participating. We have local cities in Fukushima that are participating. We have non-government organizations that are participating in the project. We also know that people buy them as a group activity. So people chip in, everybody $50, and then they build one together and they share it in the community.
Okay, actually, let's talk about building a community and the value of the community. So data is great, but data by itself doesn't tell us much. So why is this good? What problem is this solving? What is this a matter of addressing public trust? Is this a matter of providing data where there was none before?
Right. I think the two things you mentioned, providing trust and providing data that didn't exist, actually both of them are key factors in what we're trying to do. The trust building is increasingly, I think, if we look at what's happening in the world around us, is increasingly a big issue. More and more people are realizing that you can't trust your own government for everything anymore. So I think there is a big value in having checks and balances in our society around data like environmental data. I think in the past, if you would have done this 10 years ago, most people would have trusted their government for collecting data about the environment and is it safe or not. We know better now that...
and whether it's Fukushima in Japan or Flint, Michigan in the United States, there's...
Yes, exactly. And there are many examples of that. Doesn't mean that the government is doing nothing, but is that data open available? In many cases, it is not. But I think what is really happening is people have a bigger need for knowing what is happening in their direct environments. Communities want to know what is happening. They worry more about pollution and things like that. But at the same time, there is not really a good checks and balances to say that, hey, is this data really trustworthy? How can I check this? Then the second part, which you mentioned, is the data available. In many cases, it's not. So how do we solve that problem? One is we could wait for our governments to have more money to do more things. The other thing is with the current technology, let's do it ourselves. And that's kind of the Safecast idea, is,
One thing I kind of found curious is that Safecast is only available as a kit.
Yes.
So why did you make that decision? Because, obviously it was something...
Yes, why a kit and why not? So I think one thing that we came to know early on, we did a Kickstarter in 2011 where we did a Geiger counter, a manufactured device. It was very successful. At that time, one of the most successful Kickstarters at that time. We had it manufactured, but it took about a year to get it from getting the money collected and getting people the devices in hand. And that is, if you look at Kickstarters, this is a common problem. Manufacturing is hard. It takes much more time to get it right, and it's very expensive too. If you make a mistake, it multiplies. We kind of saw that experience and said, wait a minute, that's not really the greatest way to get things out, specifically small series. If we can make it easy enough for people to solder, there's always somebody in the community who can put it together. It was kind of a bet, because we knew manufacturing was kind of out of the question. We also needed money up front, which we didn't have, and we didn't want to wait a year and do nothing. So we said, let's go and see what happens. There were skeptical people who said, well, people will never build it. But it turned out that there are enough people that want to do it. And for lots of people, it became a unique experience to experience building something yourself.
Well, and I suppose that people who are interested in measuring radiation, a lot of them are fairly comfortable with a soldering iron.
Actually not.
Oh, really?
Interestingly enough, not. I would say at least half of the people participating or building have never soldered before. Okay. So the first thing they do is either they watch a YouTube video how to solder, or at a workshop, the first thing we do is first 30 minutes is solder your first resistor on the board. But we had kids build them, we had people in their 70s build them. It is not impossible.
So selling the kits, the real advantage is it keeps costs down and allows you to control quality a little better?
Yes, it keeps the cost down, but most important thing, and this is, I think, also if you look at startups, and cycle time is great, because you can make changes to kits any day, and the next kit will have the change in there. You also get an immediate feedback from people about the device. You can easily adjust for it. So even though the kit that people build today is more or less being the same for the last few years, actually every couple of months we have a small upgrade to it. And we keep on upgrading, and the cost of upgrading is almost nothing. It's literally making the next board is slightly different, or component changes. If you compare to 10 years ago, the cost of doing this has come down dramatically. With 3D printers, we use laser cutters here in Fab Cafe, and the tools for us to make that. If you were in manufacturing 10 years ago, that was something that you only could do in a company. Now that software is open source. Those equipment is available, in a cafe today. So that is huge difference. You can really build devices very easily.
But I guess that makes sense when you're talking about 1,000+ devices over 5 or 6 years. That kind of small batch manufacturing, it's right. Really expensive.
Right, it is expensive, but we don't manufacture. Yeah, so for small batches, it's expensive, and in this case, it is a volunteer work. So people basically build it themselves. So we don't have a manufacturing cost. We only have a component cost. And we were just said, let's go give it a shot, see what happens. So it worked out very, very well for us.
Since everything is kit-based and people are assembling it themselves, how do you maintain data integrity? How do you make sure everything is calibrated correctly all over the world?
Right. So that's a fundamental issue. Even if we would use manufactured devices, the same question applies. Just because it is built in a factory, it is also built by people that solder together. So there's no difference there. So first of all, that it doesn't matter.
Okay.
What does matter is how do you know the devices as such are accurate over time? Let's say in the pre-Fukushima world, Geiger counters were very expensive because they had to stand on their own. And typically they would be used by people in laboratories or universities or hospitals or nuclear facilities. And so these Geiger counters or scintillators tend to be very expensive. And they were calibrated, and every year you had to send them in, and somebody would check, yes, thing is still working, and fine. So enter internet. We do use a very good sensor. However, sensors can go bad. People may have made a mistake building the thing. And so the power of the internet is that we don't measure one location one time only. The idea is that multiple people that actually don't know each other will measure the same area over time. Okay. And this allows us to see anomalies. If somebody has a bad tube or a bad Geiger, then it will start to show up in our data, and we find those, and then we will talk to the volunteer, and we'll take that data. We will either have it fixed, or we can do something, so we can see multiple people measure.
Right, so as more and more people become part of the Safecast network, this becomes less and less of a problem.
Yes, exactly. And even if you spend tons of money on a great Geiger counter, you still don't have a guarantee that thing is going to work fine. So you're always going to have to deal with uncertainty.
So you guys are doing some pretty cool stuff, and you've gotten some great press. Are there other groups that are sharing this data or using this data or contributing to it?
Yes, so for we didn't talk about it yet, but there's one really important aspect of the project is that everything we do is open, and it is published under a Creative Commons Zero license. You can go to our website and download all the data we have collected over the last 6 years, which is, I think, more than 65 million measurements by now. We do hope you give some respect back to us, but there is no obligation whatsoever.
So what are some of the things people are doing with the data?
It's very varied. The most common use is either local government or local groups that use it to look for hotspots or to confirm for themselves that things are okay or as expected. The second is researchers. There's lots of different researchers that are doing research about effects of radiation. Then there are the less expected use for the data. To the extreme, we have artists that took our data and used our data to make artworks.
Oh, wow.
So we have a Hong Kong artist that turned it into, used our data to create a virtual tour of Fukushima, where you drive in a virtual landscape in Fukushima, where the music and the graphics are driven by the measurement data we have for that area. So, and we didn't know he was doing it because he just found the data, used it, and we just found about him later because, he was on the web because of this artwork, and we said, oh, that's our data. That's how awesome that is.
So. Well, that's kind of the whole dream of Creative Commons, isn't it?
Yes. Joita talks about serendipity, and it's a very important thing. If you think about a startup, or if you're going to think that you're going to predict everything is going to happen, it's not going to happen that way. You're going to stumble. And you have to open up yourself for that type of thing. And making things open not always is the right thing to do if you run a company, but because we're a non-profit, we're explicitly doing that. But it creates, an opportunity for people to do stuff with your data you would never have thought about. So, instead of trying to envision everything, that stumbling around actually can get you further than when you were kind of constraining yourself with what you think would happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And this, I think, one of the reasons, I think personally, why Safecast is still around after 6 years is that we typically tend not to be too much planning, try to sit down and try to think through everything. We try to experiment and see what works.
Well, the more people, the more minds there are working on a set of data, the more interesting uses you're going to get for it.
And another funny use actually is, is people are, lots of people love to have an open data set they can just play with. They're not really interested in radiation. They're just interested in an open data set they can play with. So we have all kind of other researchers that just use our data to test out their new algorithms and stuff, which is also great because we get something back. They may be able to help us refine our maps or our visualizations over time.
In an earlier interview, you mentioned that you'd taken criticism from both pro-nuclear and anti-nuclear camps over Safecast. And it seems to me that just data is data. So what was the basis for the criticisms?
I think the polarization that is happening in our societies increasingly, and which is one of the big things I personally would worry about, has made people so much, detached from data, or use data in the only that fits my purpose type of data use has become so prevalent that if you talk about something and it is not fits into your whatever your thing is, then you must be on the other side. And
so just the idea that Safecast might produce data that would contradict their beliefs?
Yes. So some people had very strong opinions about the radiation levels in Fukushima. There were people that thought that everybody would die in Japan overnight, and there were people that said absolutely nothing, no problems at all. This is all background radiation. So we had extremes. And these people tend to also, they have not looked at the data. They already know the answer, and both are wrong from a data point of view. Our point was not to figure out the problems around nuclear power or nuclear energy or anything like that. That it is a whole different thing. Our point was, I want to know what the data is,
and we'll figure out what to do once we understand the data.
And then based on that, let's have a discussion. And
the criticism you got, was this simply a very loud minority on both extremes, or?
I think it's broader than that. I think there were definitely on both of the extremes, but there was a much bigger middle group that had lost trust. And so, for the same reason, they would not trust the government. They wouldn't trust what Safecast was doing. So people were they needed to understand better how we were working. And as we were moving, we spent lots of time explaining to people that this is how it works. We also spent time documenting how we work, and we had scientists critique. Everything we do is we do it pretty much in the open, so people can come and challenge and critique, and we have lots of heated debates online about is this the right way to measure, or is this the right and isn't it?
And so, it's a truly global community as well.
Yeah, so exactly, and people people come out and say, hey, is this really the right way to do it? So over time we have been kind of battle tested in terms of fighting these battles. If anything, we kind of see ourselves as pro data. Right. Instead of pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear, we say it's pro-data. That's the problem we're trying to solve here.
So have you largely overcome that trust problem, at least here in Japan?
I don't know. I think we're still. I think in Japan the trust that was lost in the government still needs lots of work. Specifically, if you go to Fukushima, there's still lots of people that have big trust issues. We obviously have tried to do whatever we could do about that. We know we have dialogues with government groups, etc., about what we think they can do better.
Well, actually, since the Safecast movement, a lot of its roots were in the mistrust of the government data. Has the Japanese government been supportive of your efforts, either on a national or local level?
I would say in the beginning, nor obstructive nor supportive. We kind of worked in our own space. I think now we have much more interactions where there is, depending on the government, we're not only interacting with government in Japan, we're working on a global scale, we're working in different countries, and it depends on the country. But there's a general interest to understand how we operate and how this works. And the reason for that is it does build better trust. It also solves a logistical problem. If you look at Fukushima, it's a huge area. You're talking about a massive area that got contaminated. And how do you measure that? It's just not possible for a government to have an army ready to go in and measure it.
So. Well, I could see something like, in the exclusion zone is a very special case, because that's not, a lot of places still aren't safe for people to go back in. But for a city in the rest of Japan, it seems like it would just be ideal to put a bunch of these Safecast devices on the backs of buses and let them monitor the city as they go about their business.
Yes. So in some cities we're actually doing that.
All right.
They're not buses, but they're motorbikes. But yes, we are with some cities we're doing that. It's really an experiment to figure out how that works best. Having the technology is one thing, but also even if the government would use the Safecast device to measure, it still doesn't solve the trust issue. So you need both. You need, ideally you want the government to up their measurements, but at the same time you also want to have a way to keep it in balance.
But it seems to me that would be an ideal way of getting that trust back, because the government is taking their measurements and releasing them, and any citizen can double check.
Exactly. I don't think we're there yet, but I think I think there is more realization that having citizen science, what is the role of citizen science? Does it have, in this case, is citizen measuring, is that useful or not? I think it is very useful. It also is very useful for officials to say, hey, we can compare. Are we in the ballpark or not? Are we, and if it is in the ballpark, there's nothing wrong with it. Then it gives an extra level of confidence on both sides that this is what it is.
And if there's a discrepancy, both sides can investigate further.
Yes. The other thing is I think what's important is that how do we make sure that our data, which is now becoming our history, doesn't get erased? So by having it in two separate entities makes it hard for data to disappear.
I mean, looking forward, I think it's easy to see why this is beneficial for everyone involved. But Safecast is a disruptive model, and people being disrupted don't like it. And so Japan especially, I mean, and this is what I've heard from just so many people who've been on the show, what you're doing is replacing what has been the territory of universities and government agencies, I mean, since the end of the war. Mm-hmm. And did you receive any pushback on that?
Not in the sense of pushback in obstructing what we were doing, but definitely lots of people were very skeptical in the beginning. You know, this is amateurs and blah blah blah. Specific. If you look at the scientific community, if you have spent your whole life building super expensive equipment to measure, and you have a bunch of guys walking with relatively cheap stuff that actually outperforming what you're doing, of course you're walking in somebody else's terrain. The reality though is that nobody had a really good answer after Fukushima, and that is, I think, the essence there. So even though let's say the authorities etc. may have had opinions, the reality was they had maybe a few cars that were equipped with equipment to measure at best. They didn't have the scale or a way to scale up or a way to engage, and so they never had thought that through. And of course, an accident like this doesn't happen regularly, and it's at accidents like this are the opportunities there to see what works and doesn't work. And I think that's where the disruption is. The disruption definitely was quick to react. We were very fast to build and do, and that's in Japan. People are afraid to fail, afraid to take a risk, so they would take much more time than we did in building the equipment and test it out, and that would be too late. If you're too late, you actually take a bigger risk because now you've missed the whole opportunity. And and I think in Japan, I've been here for a very long time myself. The fear of failure, which wasn't there in Japan after the war, etc. It's something that has built up over the last 20, 30 years. Has become a major, obstructive factor in trying out new stuff. Now, this is a generalization. There's lots of people that are trying to do it differently. But in general, if you look at larger companies, nobody, the funny thing is nobody came up with a better Geiger counter after the whole accident. They're still working on it maybe, but I've not seen it.
So has the central government and universities kind of come around to the Safecast way of thinking over the last 6 years?
I think so. First of all, what's important to notice is that K University was a partner early on with Safecast, almost from the beginning. Professor Murai from K University. We also work together with researchers from Tokyo University very onwards. So I think in the academic community, there is a very wide range of people. But these were the people in the academic community that traditionally didn't do radiation measurement. They were active in other areas. So that is, the people that were traditionally in those spaces, they took some time to come around. And, we kind of addressed that issue, more importantly last year by publishing a scientific paper about our measurement techniques to address some of the academic discussions where people were kept on asking the same question, but is this scientifically okay? So we published it in one of the most prestigious journals. We had it fully peer-reviewed, took a year to get it peer-reviewed. It's now one of the most popular publications in that journal. We're in the top 10. But we went back and said, citizen science is, after all, science. So, and with our volunteers, we worked on it, and we published some of the principles behind Safecast and why is this a viable way to measure.
But it makes perfect sense. I mean,
and being challenged by the academics is good because that dialogue is important.
Well, it's any organization, whether it's an NPO or a startup, goes through that same trajectory where when you're out of the gate, you're trying anything. You're taping things together, just trying to solve a problem any way you can, and then fix the smaller problems and obtain legitimacy. And I think as you grow.
If you think about being disruptive, etc., I think what's really important is that if it doesn't trigger dialogues, if it only triggers, people being upset with each other, then you may not be on a winning path. I think creating the dialogues and being critiqued and also taking in critique while you disrupt and being open to that and of course quickly react to that actually is the way to go. So, and I think over time, people have come around and said, well, this is a whole different way of doing things. So we have inspired lots of people in other areas, not just not in radiation measurement, but in lots of other areas, where they try to build a similar type of model for solving their problem.
I find it incredibly encouraging that Japan in particular is taking to this philosophy as well as they are. Right. The idea of citizen science, of data sharing, of open data, So how do you think citizen science is going to develop in Japan over the next 10 years, for example? What changes are we going to see here?
I don't know, because citizen science is it's like a buzzword, and we've been doing so-called citizen science for like 6 years, but I've seen other groups doing things in very different ways. What I'm sure about those is that we're going to see more citizen science-like projects that are increasingly more successful and more impactful. And the reason for that is very simple: is the technology that drives it is getting cheaper and cheaper. The access people have to it is getting better, and people are having better tools to corroborate on that. What we have seen is that we have inspired quite a few researchers or other groups doing the same thing with something else. We're teaching people how to do Safecast. We're sharing our way of thinking. So I'm quite sure more of this will happen.
So what other kind of problems are people attacking with citizen science?
Okay, so one example is a researcher that is trying to focus on the quality of water. He's been trying to figure out how can we measure water at people's homes. But the same thing, he wants to do a similar way as we're doing. Another researcher has been trying to measure the ocean for radiation. Ocean is very big, as you know, and and there's a technical problem with that. You can't just put a Geiger counter above water and measure it. You need to actually take 20 liters of water, boil it until it is completely evaporated, and then the residue you put in a Geiger counter and you measure it. It's not so easy. He was doing this on his own as a researcher, and he's one of the leading researchers in this. And he could only get so many samples as he could cook water.
I can imagine, yes.
Right, so, just imagine cooking seawater. It's not entirely, a great experience. So what he has done is, after we met him, he said, wow, this is a great idea if I can get people to collect the water for me. So we kind of teamed up, and he started to do the same thing. So now he has a kit that he mails to people. They fill it up with water, they send it back to him, he does the cooking and measurement. He sends back the results to the people that collected it, and he gets the data he's looking for. So there are many inspirational things that are spin-offs of the same idea, and I'm quite sure there will be much more of this. I think in the whole developing side of the world, there will be much more of this than there will be in the developing side. If you look at places like Africa or Asia or whatever, where there is huge pollution problems, etc., I think people are going to be armed with much cheaper equipment that will allow them in their communities to have much more impact about what is happening. And I think that's where we'll see citizen science revolution.
Excellent. Well, I hope we do see that. Well, listen, before we wrap up, I want to ask you what I call my magic wand question. And you spent 6 years trying to get this innovation to become mainstream in Japan. If I gave you a magic wand and I told you could change one thing about Japan, anything at all, the legal system, the education system, the way people think about risk, anything at all to make it easier for new innovation to take root in Japan, what would you change?
I think it's a combination of the educational system and the risk attitude towards risk. I think that's a big thing. If Japan can change that, they will have a much better way to innovate. So basically, the educational system teaching from kids onwards about failure can be a way to learn. Failure is not necessarily bad. Failure can be very good. People are way too much worried about the downside than the upside. Failure is, by definition, not good or bad, but definitely making failure by definition bad is a big handicap. And I think it roots in the educational system. It roots in some cultural, but if you go back in history, not so long ago, the young entrepreneurs after the Second World War were very different from the people we see right now. So they weren't, afraid of taking a risk or a failure. They were actually quite courageous. So I think, things have somehow gone into a direction that values, low risk over progress. If that changes, I think, for innovation in Japan, I think it will have an impact.
All right. Well, listen, Pieter, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
And we're back. We're not quite there yet, but projects like Safecast and citizen science more generally have the potential to invert the relationship between government scientists and citizens. You see, environmental monitoring and research projects are usually far too large for an individual organization to undertake. And historically, The solution has been to have the government take on that responsibility on behalf of all parties. It's a good system, and it's worked pretty well so far. What's interesting here is that now some projects are simply too large for the government to undertake, but individual concerned citizens, acting together, can do the research and get the data. There's no way a government program would be able to get funding to monitor radiation or pollution on every corner of every street, but concerned individuals working together are already heading in that direction. And quite frankly, anything that involves citizens collaborating directly with a government agency towards a common goal, or citizens working directly with the scientific community, will go a long way to improving people's understanding of government and science, and it likely will improve the quality and responsiveness of both government and science. The fact that Pieter and the Safecast team are now winning over the scientific establishment on their own terms by publishing in peer-reviewed journals is something that all startups can learn from. This is the other side of disruption, and it's the more important and more difficult side. The real value in disruption is not the destruction of the old way of doing something. The value is replacing it with something sustainable and better, with something that improves people's lives, something that becomes the new way of doing things. If you've got an experience in crowdsourcing or citizen science, Pieter and I would love to hear from you. So come by disruptingjapan.com/show089 and let us know what you think. When you come by the site, you'll see all the links and notes that Pieter and I talked about and much, much more in the resources section of the post. But most of all, thanks for listening. And thank you for letting people interested in Japanese startups know about the show. I'm Tim Romero, and thanks for listening to Disrupting Japan. Disrupting Japan is a proud member of the Japan Podcast Network. It's a community of some of the best audio content about Japan. So if you're looking for other high-quality podcasts about Japan, check out the other shows in the Japan Podcast Network.